The words hung in the sterile hospital air like a death sentence as Margaret Chen faced the man who destroyed everything she'd worked 30 years to build. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, chief of cardiac surgery at St. Mary's Medical Center, stood frozen in his blood-stained scrubs, knowing that the grieving mother before him held evidence that could end more than just his career. What he didn't know was that Margaret had been recording their conversation, that she'd spent 6 months infiltrating his inner circle, and that the flash drive in her trembling hand contained proof of a medical conspiracy that had killed dozens of patients for profit. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft chime that sounded like a countdown timer. In exactly 72 hours, one of them would be destroyed forever. But which one would depend on whether Margaret's quest for justice could overcome a system designed to protect doctors who'd forgotten their oath to do no harm. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever wondered how far a mother would go to expose the truth when the people sworn to heal become the ones who kill. We wonder where you're watching from tonight, because maybe you've met someone like her, someone who changed everything with one small act. Sarah Martinez wiped down table 7 for the 3rd time that morning, the familiar ritual bringing no comfort today. At 28, she'd been working the morning shift at Lou's Diner in Millbrook, Pennsylvania for 6 years, long enough to know the rhythm of every regular customer's breathing, the way they stirred their coffee, the exact words they'd use to order. But Walter Hennings hadn't shown up yesterday, and his absence sat in her chest like a stone. The old man had claimed the corner booth every morning at 7 sharp for 4 years, ordering black coffee, wheat toast, no butter. He'd read the Millbrook Gazette cover to cover, leave exactly 15% tip, and nod goodbye without meeting her eyes. Sarah found the brass police badge wedged between the salt shaker and the napkin dispenser where Walter always sat. The metal felt warm despite the morning chill seeping through the diner's single-pane windows. She'd always suspected there was more to the quiet 74-year-old man than he let on. The way he listened when other customers complained about the town council, how his eyes sharpened whenever someone mentioned Mayor Bradley or the endless construction projects that never seemed to get finished. Walter had the bearing of someone who'd spent decades watching, waiting, cataloging details that others missed. Sarah slipped the badge into her apron pocket, planning to return it when he came in today. She had no way of knowing that Walter Hennings would never sit at table 7 again, or that his final gift to her would expose the kind of corruption that destroys small towns from the inside out. The morning rush passed in a blur of coffee refills and scrambled eggs, but Sarah's attention kept drifting to the empty booth. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop asked about Walter. Apparently, he hadn't picked up his weekly carnations either. Tom Bradley Jr., fresh out of college and working at his father's real estate office, made a joke about old people being unreliable. But Sarah noticed how his smile didn't reach his eyes when he glanced toward table 7. Even Lou, who owned the diner and usually stayed buried in paperwork, emerged from the back office twice to scan the dining room. Walter Hennings had become part of Millbrook's morning routine, as dependable as sunrise, and his absence felt like the first crack in something that had always seemed solid. By 10:30, the breakfast crowd had thinned to a handful of coffee nurses and one traveling salesman reading yesterday's sports section. Sarah was refilling the sugar dispensers when she heard the unmistakable whine of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. The sound grew louder until it seemed to fill every corner of the diner, rattling the windows and making conversations impossible. She looked up to see the aircraft descending toward the vacant lot behind the building, the same patch of weedy ground where she'd been nurturing wild daisies since her 2nd year working here. The flowers had been Walter's suggestion, actually. He'd mentioned one morning that the lot would look prettier with some color, and Sarah had taken it upon herself to scatter seeds and carry water from the diner's kitchen. Now those same flowers disappeared under the helicopter's landing gear, their yellow petals scattered like confetti in the downdraft. 3 men emerged from the aircraft with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to making dramatic entrances. Their dark suits looked expensive and out of place in Millbrook, where formal wear meant khakis and a polo shirt. The lead man was tall and angular, with silver hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he'd spent his career delivering news that changed people's lives. His companions flanked him like bodyguards, one carrying a leather briefcase and the other holding what appeared to be legal documents. They moved across the lot without acknowledging the scattered petals or the small crowd of onlookers gathering on Main Street. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, the brass badge suddenly feeling heavier in her pocket as the three strangers approached Lou's diner with the methodical purpose of men on official business. The bell above the entrance chimed once as they entered, but the usual cheerful sound seemed ominous now. The tall man scanned the dining room with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the checkered linoleum, the hand-painted menu board, the mismatched chairs that Lou had collected over the years. His gaze settled on Sarah, who was standing by the coffee station with a pot in one hand and a dish towel in the other. "Sarah Martinez?" His voice carried the authority of someone who expected immediate answers. When she nodded, he introduced himself as Agent David Chen from the Internal Revenue Service, accompanied by two colleagues whose names she immediately forgot. They requested a private conversation, and Sarah led them to the back booth near the kitchen, her legs suddenly unsteady. She could feel every remaining customer watching as she sat across from three federal agents, Walter's badge pressing against her hip like a talisman she didn't understand. Agent Chen opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick enough to represent someone's entire life. "Miss Martinez, we're here regarding the estate of Walter Edmund Hennings, who passed away Tuesday evening at Millbrook General Hospital." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed made her throat tighten with unexpected grief. Walter had been more than just a customer. He'd been the steady presence that marked the beginning of every day, the quiet man who'd listened to her complaints about difficult customers and town politics without judgment. Agent Chen continued speaking about estate proceedings and legal requirements, but Sarah found herself focusing on irrelevant details, the way sunlight streaming through the window highlighted dust motes in the air, how Agent Chen's watch caught the light when he gestured, the faint smell of bacon grease that had soaked into the diner's walls over decades of breakfast service. "Mr. Hennings has left you a substantial inheritance," Agent Chen said, and Sarah's attention snapped back to the conversation. "However, there are conditions attached that require your immediate attention." He slid a document across the table, the legal language dense and intimidating. Sarah had never inherited anything more valuable than her grandmother's costume jewelry, and the concept of Walter, quiet, unassuming Walter, having enough money to leave anyone seemed impossible. But there it was in black and white, $2.1 million, contingent upon Sarah's completion of what the will described as a thorough investigation into financial irregularities within the municipal government of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. She had 90 days to submit a comprehensive report, or the money would transfer to the American Civil Liberties Union. Walter, it seemed, had been planning this moment for a very long time. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, a combination that reminded Sarah of Walter's jacket whenever he'd come in from the rain. Attorney Margaret Walsh, no relation to the town treasurer, she emphasized twice, spread Walter's documents across a mahogany table that probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. The will was 12 pages of legal language that boiled down to something unprecedented. A waitress with a high school diploma had been chosen to investigate municipal corruption in a town where the most exciting scandal usually involved someone parking in the fire chief's reserved spot. Margaret Walsh explained that Walter had revised his will every 6 months for the past 3 years, each version more specific about Sarah's qualifications and the investigation's scope. He'd apparently spent considerable time observing her interactions with customers, her natural curiosity about town affairs, and what he described as an instinctive understanding of right and wrong that formal education often dilutes. Sarah learned that Walter Edmund Hennings had retired from the Philadelphia Police Department in 2015 after 32 years as a detective specializing in financial crimes. He'd moved to Millbrook seeking quiet retirement, but became increasingly concerned about irregularities in the town's budget during his first year attending public meetings. His notebooks, now Sarah's inheritance along with the money, contained 3 years of meticulous observations about town council proceedings, contract awards, and budget allocations that didn't add up. Walter had documented patterns of nepotism, inflated invoices, and construction projects that existed primarily on paper. But as the outsider without local connections, he'd lacked the social credibility to pursue his suspicions. Sarah, however, had been born in Millbrook, graduated from Millbrook High, and possessed the kind of community trust that Walter knew was essential for exposing corruption without triggering a defensive backlash. The weight of Walter's final gift pressed down on Sarah as she walked home to the two-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother. Maria Martinez had been fighting rheumatoid arthritis for 5 years, and the medical bills had already forced them to take out a second mortgage on a house that wasn't worth half what they owed. Sarah's younger brother Miguel was finishing his second year at Penn State on partial scholarship, and she'd been working double shifts to help cover his expenses. The $2.1 million represented more than financial security. It was the difference between survival and actually living. But the price Walter had attached felt overwhelming. Sarah had taken exactly 2 accounting classes at the community college before dropping out to help support her family, and her knowledge of municipal government extended to complaining about potholes and wondering why the library's hours kept getting cut. That evening, Sarah sat at her mother's bedside and read portions of Walter's notebooks aloud. Maria Martinez had immigrated from Mexico in the 1980s and possessed the immigrants' keen awareness of how power structures functioned, who benefited from the status quo, and why ordinary people rarely challenged those systems. She listened carefully as Sarah described Walter's observations about Mayor Tom Bradley's construction contracts, Councilman Rick Morrison's family business receiving preferential treatment, and Treasurer Janet Walsh's evasive responses whenever citizens asked specific questions about budget allocations. Maria had cleaned office buildings for 15 years before her arthritis forced retirement, and she'd observed enough after-hours conversations between executives to recognize the signs of financial impropriety. "Mija," she said, her voice still strong despite the pain medication. "That old man saw something in you that you don't see in yourself. Maybe it's time you found out what that was." Sarah spent most of that night reading Walter's notebooks by lamplight, her mother sleeping fitfully beside her. The handwriting was neat and methodical, the observations organized by date and topic with cross-references that revealed a detective's systematic mind. Walter had attended every public town council meeting for 3 years, sitting in the back row and recording not just official proceedings but body language, sidebar conversations, and patterns of voting that suggested prearranged decisions. He documented how Morrison Construction consistently underbid on municipal projects, then received change orders that doubled or tripled the original contract amounts. He'd noted that Mayor Bradley's real estate development company had purchased land adjacent to proposed infrastructure improvements weeks before those projects were publicly announced. Most damning, Walter had identified at least 8 instances where the town had paid for work that was never completed, services that were never rendered, and materials that were never delivered. The notebooks contained more than evidence. They revealed Walter's growing frustration with his inability to act on what he'd discovered. As a retired out-of-state police officer, he lacked jurisdiction and local credibility. His attempts to raise questions during public comment periods had been politely dismissed by council members who praised his civic engagement while ignoring his specific concerns. Walter's final entries, dated just days before his death, expressed his conviction that Sarah Martinez possessed the community standing and moral authority necessary to force accountability. He'd written detailed instructions for accessing public records, tips for identifying financial irregularities, and even contact information for investigative reporters at regional newspapers. The last entry was dated the morning before Walter missed his final breakfast at Lou's Diner. Sarah has the courage to ask questions that make powerful people uncomfortable. More importantly, people trust her answers. By dawn, Sarah had made her decision. She called the diner to request 2 weeks of unpaid leave, knowing that Lou would grumble, but understanding. Walter had been everyone's customer, and his death had affected the entire morning routine. She used her savings to purchase a laptop computer and subscribe to the online services that Walter had recommended for researching public records and financial documents. Most importantly, she began visiting the places Walter had identified as essential to understanding Millbrook's power structure: the town clerk's office, the monthly council meetings, and the informal gathering spots where local business leaders discussed matters that never appeared in official minutes. Sarah Martinez, who'd never imagined herself as anyone's investigator, was about to discover that small-town corruption often relied on ordinary citizens' reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions. The brass police badge remained in her apron pocket throughout those first days of investigation, a tangible reminder of Walter's faith in her abilities. Sarah found herself touching it during moments of doubt or intimidation, drawing strength from the weight of his expectations. She didn't yet understand that Walter had chosen her not despite her lack of formal qualifications, but because of her freedom from the professional constraints that might have prevented a trained investigator from pursuing certain lines of inquiry. Sarah Martinez was about to prove that sometimes the most effective detective is someone nobody suspects of detecting anything at all. The Millbrook Town Hall occupied a converted Victorian mansion that had seen better decades, its hardwood floors creaking under the weight of filing cabinets and copy machines that belonged in a museum. Sarah arrived 15 minutes before the monthly council meeting, claiming a seat in the back row where Walter had observed for 3 years. The agenda promised discussions of road maintenance, library funding, and approval of various municipal contracts, the kind of routine business that usually drew audiences of fewer than 10 residents. Tonight's crowd was slightly larger, perhaps because word had spread about the IRS agents visiting Lou's diner, though Sarah noticed that conversation stopped whenever she made eye contact with longtime neighbors. Mayor Tom Bradley called the meeting to order with the practiced efficiency of someone who preferred discussions to be brief and decisions to be predetermined. Sarah's first revelation came during the treasurer's report, delivered by Janet Walsh in a monotone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. The numbers were presented as percentages and generalizations rather than specific dollar amounts, making it impossible to understand where money actually went or why certain line items had increased dramatically over the past year. When Sarah raised her hand to request clarification about infrastructure spending, Mayor Bradley acknowledged her question with the kind of indulgent smile typically reserved for children asking about complicated adult matters. Janet Walsh provided a response that used many words to convey very little information, explaining that detailed breakdowns were available for review during regular business hours for any citizen with legitimate research purposes. The phrase, legitimate research purposes, was delivered with subtle emphasis that suggested Sarah's interest might not qualify. After the meeting, Sarah lingered in the lobby examining the public notices posted on bulletin boards that most people passed without reading. Building permits, contract awards, and planning commission decisions revealed patterns that became clearer when viewed chronologically. Morrison Construction had been awarded 17 municipal contracts in the past 18 months, including several that had been rebid after other companies submitted lower initial proposals. The rebidding process consistently resulted in Morrison receiving awards at prices that were higher than the original winning bids, justified by vague references to specialized local knowledge and enhanced service capabilities. Sarah photographed each notice with her phone. Building the documentary foundation that Walter's notebooks had taught her was essential for any financial investigation. The next morning found Sarah at the county clerk's office, armed with Walter's list of documents that were public record under Pennsylvania's right-to-know law. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Diane Kowalski, seemed genuinely pleased to help someone who was actually interested in reviewing municipal records. Most citizens, Diane explained, only visited when they needed marriage licenses or had disputes about property taxes. Sarah's request for 3 years of town council meeting minutes, contract awards, and financial reports represented more civic engagement than Diane typically saw in a month. She provided Sarah with a carrel near the window and unlimited access to the copy machine, warning that some of the older documents were handwritten and might be difficult to read. Walter's notebooks proved invaluable as Sarah worked through boxes of municipal records. His cross-references helped her identify discrepancies between approved budgets and actual expenditures, revealing a pattern of cost overruns that consistently benefited the same handful of local businesses. The Morrison construction contracts were particularly illuminating when examined in detail. The company had been paid $8.2 million over 18 months for a comprehensive sewer system rehabilitation project that was supposed to modernize the town's infrastructure and prevent flooding during heavy rains. But Sarah's neighbors still complained about backed-up storm drains every time it rained, and several streets showed no evidence of recent excavation or pipe replacement. The disconnect between payment and performance was stark enough that even someone without engineering expertise could recognize the problem. Sarah's investigation took on new urgency when she discovered invoices for materials that had never been delivered and services that had never been performed. Morrison Construction had submitted bills for 12 truckloads of specialized concrete pipe, charged at premium rates for what the invoices described as custom drainage solutions designed for Millbrook's unique geological requirements. But when Sarah drove through town looking for evidence of new pipe installation, she found that most streets showed no signs of recent underground work. The few areas where excavation had occurred revealed standard concrete pipe that was available from any construction supplier at a fraction of the specialized rate Morrison had charged. The pattern suggested systematic overbilling that had inflated the project's cost by millions of dollars. The breakthrough came when Sarah found Morrison Construction's original business license application from 15 years earlier. The company's registered address was identical to Councilman Rick Morrison's home address, and the incorporation documents listed Morrison's wife as the company's secretary-treasurer. Pennsylvania law clearly prohibited elected officials from voting on contracts that provided financial benefit to their immediate family members. But Rick Morrison had participated in every vote approving his company's municipal work. The conflict of interest was so blatant that Sarah initially assumed she'd misunderstood something fundamental about local government ethics. She spent an entire afternoon researching state regulations, hoping to find some exception that would explain how Morrison's participation could be legal. Instead, she discovered that his voting pattern constituted a textbook example of the kind of corruption that the state attorney general's office regularly prosecuted. Armed with copies of financial records, contract documents, and ethics regulations, Sarah began building the comprehensive case that Walter's will required. She created spreadsheets comparing Morrison Construction's municipal payments with the actual work performed, documenting a discrepancy of approximately $12 million over 3 years. She identified at least 6 other local businesses that had received contracts through similar processes, suggesting that Millbrook's corruption extended beyond a single company or family. Most importantly, Sarah discovered that Mayor Bradley's real estate development company had purchased land that increased significantly in value after infrastructure improvements that never actually materialized. The pattern indicated coordinated fraud rather than simple mismanagement, and the amounts involved suggested federal rather than local prosecution might be appropriate. The brass badge in Sarah's pocket felt heavier as her investigation progressed, weighted with the responsibility Walter had placed on her shoulders. She understood now why he'd chosen someone outside the established power structure. Anyone with professional ties to local government or business would have faced pressure to minimize their findings or keep quiet about what they discovered. Sarah Martinez, who owed nothing to Mayor Bradley or Councilman Morrison and had no business relationships that could be threatened, possessed the independence necessary to pursue her investigation wherever the evidence led. Walter's final case was becoming her first, and she was beginning to understand that small-town corruption could be just as devastating as any crime committed in a major city. The Pennsylvania Municipal Authorities Association website became Sarah's classroom as she taught herself to decode budget documents and contract procedures that seemed deliberately designed to confuse ordinary citizens. Walter's notebooks included references to accounting principles and auditing techniques. But Sarah needed to understand how municipal finance actually worked before she could prove that Millbrook's version was corrupted. She spent hours in the public library, grateful that her investigation coincided with the librarian's vacation week, which meant fewer questions about why a waitress was suddenly researching government procurement standards and conflict of interest regulations. The learning curve was steep, but Sarah discovered that her years of managing the diner's inventory and scheduling had given her an intuitive understanding of how organizations should function when resources are limited and accountability matters. Sarah's first confrontation with the system came when she requested detailed expenditure records from Janet Walsh's office at Town Hall. The treasurer's assistant, a nervous young man named Kevin, who'd graduated from high school with Sarah's brother, seemed genuinely confused by the request. Most citizens who visited the office wanted to pay parking tickets or register complaints about snow removal, not examine 3 years of financial data with the intensity of a forensic accountant. Kevin explained that while the information was technically public record, it would take several days to compile and copy, and there might be fees associated with extensive document reproduction. Sarah offered to pay any reasonable costs and emphasized that she was exercising her legal rights under state sunshine laws, not making an unreasonable request for special treatment. The delay tactics became obvious when Kevin called 2 days later to explain that the requested documents were temporarily unavailable because they were being reviewed by the town's auditing firm. When Sarah asked for the name and contact information of the auditing firm, Kevin said he'd need to check with Mrs. Walsh and call back. That return call never came, but Sarah received a voice message from Janet Walsh herself, suggesting that they meet to discuss what specific information Sarah needed and why she was interested in reviewing financial records in such detail. The treasurer's tone was professionally courteous, but Sarah detected an undercurrent of concern that confirmed she was asking the right questions. Walter's notebooks had warned that corrupt officials often used bureaucratic delays and procedural confusion to discourage citizen oversight, hoping that people would grow frustrated and abandon their inquiries. Rather than wait for Janet Walsh's preferred meeting, Sarah attended the next town council work session, a monthly gathering that was technically open to the public but rarely attended by anyone except reporters from the Millbrook Gazette. The work sessions were supposed to allow council members to discuss issues informally before voting at regular meetings, but Sarah observed that most decisions appeared to be finalized during these supposedly preliminary discussions. Mayor Bradley ran the sessions with casual efficiency, asking perfunctory questions about agenda items while clearly expecting unanimous approval of his recommendations. When Sarah raised her hand during the public comment period, the mayor's expression shifted from routine politeness to something approaching wariness. Sarah's questions were specific and well-researched, focusing on the discrepancy she'd identified between Morrison Construction's invoices and the infrastructure improvements that were supposed to result from those payments. She asked why the town had approved change orders that doubled the cost of the sewer rehabilitation project, without requiring documentation of the additional work performed. She inquired about the selection process for contractors and whether the town had considered soliciting competitive bids for projects that exceeded certain dollar thresholds. Most pointedly, she asked whether council members were required to abstain from voting on contracts that might benefit their immediate family members or business associates. Each question was delivered in the respectful tone that Sarah had perfected during years of dealing with difficult diner customers. But the content was clearly calculated to make council members uncomfortable. Mayor Bradley's responses followed a pattern that Walter's notebooks had identified. Acknowledged the legitimacy of citizen concerns while providing answers that sounded responsive without actually addressing the specific issues raised. He praised Sarah's civic engagement and emphasized the town's commitment to transparency and accountability. He explained that infrastructure projects were complex undertakings that often required modifications as work progressed, which was why change orders were a normal part of municipal contracting. He assured Sarah that all council members understood their ethical obligations and that the town's legal counsel reviewed any potential conflicts of interest. The responses were smooth and professional, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd handled similar questions before, but they didn't actually answer what Sarah had asked. The real revelation came after the meeting, when Sarah lingered in the parking lot and overheard a heated conversation between Rick Morrison and Janet Walsh. Morrison was angry about Sarah's questions and frustrated that some waitress was stirring up trouble about matters she didn't understand. Walsh urged Morrison to stay calm and suggested that Sarah's interest would probably fade once she realized how complex municipal finance could be. Their assumption that Sarah lacked the persistence or intelligence necessary for sustained investigation revealed exactly the kind of arrogance that Walter had identified as corruption's greatest weakness. Powerful people often defeated themselves by underestimating the determination of citizens who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth. Sarah's breakthrough came when she discovered that Pennsylvania municipalities were required to publish annual financial reports that provided detailed breakdowns of expenditures and revenues. Millbrook's reports for the past 3 years were available through the state's online database, and they told a very different story than the vague summaries Janet Walsh had presented during council meetings. The official reports revealed that the town's infrastructure spending had increased by nearly 400% over 3 years, while the actual infrastructure showed little evidence of improvement proportional to that investment. More damning, the reports indicated that Millbrook's debt-to-revenue ratio had deteriorated to levels that typically triggered state oversight of municipal finances. Armed with official data that contradicted the rosy picture painted during council meetings, Sarah began contacting regional newspapers and state agencies that monitored municipal finance. She learned that several Pennsylvania towns had faced federal investigation for similar patterns of inflated contracts and phantom projects, and that the state attorney general's office maintained a hotline for reporting suspected municipal corruption. Walter's final case was becoming more than a personal inheritance. It was evolving into a civic responsibility that could protect Millbrook from financial catastrophe. Sarah Martinez, who'd started her investigation to secure her family's future, was discovering that exposing corruption required the same skills she'd developed serving breakfast: paying attention to details, treating everyone with respect, and never accepting easy answers to difficult questions. The mayor's office occupied the corner suite of Town Hall's second floor, its windows offering a view of Main Street that included Lou's Diner and the vacant lot where wild daisies were beginning to grow back after the helicopter's visit. Sarah had requested a private meeting with Tom Bradley, ostensibly to discuss her concerns about municipal finance, but actually to present the evidence she'd compiled over the past month of investigation. Bradley had agreed to the appointment with the patronizing courtesy of a busy executive making time for a well-meaning but misguided constituent. His secretary offered coffee and pastries, the kind of hospitality that was supposed to make visitors feel welcomed while subtly emphasizing the power differential between elected officials and ordinary citizens. Sarah accepted the coffee but declined the pastries, understanding that she needed to maintain focus for what was essentially an interrogation disguised as a civic discussion. Mayor Bradley began the meeting by praising Sarah's dedication to community involvement and expressing his appreciation for citizens who took an active interest in local government. He explained that municipal finance was more complex than most people realized, with regulations and procedures that could seem confusing to anyone without specialized training. His tone was educational rather than condescending, delivered with the practiced sincerity of someone who'd spent years convincing voters that their concerns were being addressed even when substantial changes were never implemented. Bradley emphasized his administration's commitment to transparency and fiscal responsibility, noting that Millbrook had managed to maintain essential services despite budget pressures that had forced other small towns to raise taxes or cut programs. Sarah listened politely before placing her laptop on Bradley's desk and opening the spreadsheet that summarized 3 years of financial discrepancies. The document was organized chronologically and cross-referenced with supporting evidence, displaying the kind of methodical precision that Walter's notebooks had taught her was essential for effective investigation. She began with the Morrison construction contracts, explaining how the company had been paid $8.2 million for sewer system improvements that were largely invisible to anyone driving through town. Sarah presented photographs of streets that showed no evidence of recent excavation, invoices for materials that had never been delivered, and change orders that had doubled project costs without corresponding increases in scope or quality. Bradley's demeanor shifted as he realized that Sarah's investigation was far more comprehensive than he'd anticipated. The patronizing courtesy was replaced by careful attention as he scrolled through her data, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own familiarity with the financial irregularities she'd identified. When Sarah presented evidence of Morrison's conflict of interest, voting on contracts that benefited his own construction company, Bradley's responses became more defensive. He argued that Morrison had always abstained from final votes on his company's contracts, though Sarah's records showed that he'd participated in preliminary discussions and committee work that shaped those decisions. The mayor's explanations became increasingly strained as Sarah presented each piece of evidence with the methodical persistence of someone who'd done her homework thoroughly. The confrontation reached its turning point when Sarah presented copies of the state reports that contradicted the financial summaries Bradley's administration had provided to citizens. The discrepancies were too large to dismiss as accounting errors or differences in reporting methodology, and Sarah had prepared responses to every explanation Bradley attempted to offer. When he suggested that her investigation might be based on misunderstandings about municipal finance, Sarah cited specific Pennsylvania statutes that governed conflict of interest and procurement procedures. When he argued that Morrison Construction's pricing was competitive with industry standards, Sarah presented quotes from other contractors that were 30 to 40% lower for identical work. The conversation became a chess match where Bradley found himself consistently outmaneuvered by someone he'd initially dismissed as unqualified to challenge his authority. Sarah's ultimatum was delivered with the quiet intensity she'd learned from years of dealing with customers who tried to skip out on their checks or mistreat her co-workers. She explained that Walter's will required her to submit a comprehensive report about municipal financial irregularities, and that she'd already gathered enough evidence to support serious allegations of corruption and mismanagement. She offered Bradley two options: work with her to implement immediate reforms that would restore accountability and transparency, or face the consequences when her report was forwarded to state and federal law enforcement agencies. The 30-day deadline was firm and non-negotiable, reflecting Walter's understanding that corrupt officials would use delay tactics to minimize their exposure or destroy evidence that might support prosecution. Bradley's response revealed the calculating mindset that had enabled years of unchecked corruption. He questioned Sarah's legal standing to make demands of elected officials, suggested that her investigation might constitute harassment of public servants, and hinted that pursuing her allegations could result in defamation litigation that would bankrupt her family. The threats were delivered with superficial civility, but their intent was unmistakable: back down or face retaliation that would destroy her financially and socially. Sarah had anticipated this response, partly because Walter's notebooks had described similar intimidation tactics, and partly because her years working in customer service had taught her to recognize bullies regardless of their social position or professional credentials. The meeting's aftermath provided Sarah with unexpected validation when she overheard heated arguments between Bradley, Morrison, and Walsh in the hallway outside the mayor's office. Morrison was angry about what he called Sarah's vendetta against his family's business, while Walsh expressed concern about the legal implications of the evidence Sarah had presented. Their discussion revealed that Sarah's investigation had progressed far enough to threaten their established system of mutual benefit, and that they were beginning to turn on each other as the pressure increased. Walter's notebooks had predicted this dynamic. Corruption conspiracies often collapsed when participants realized that protecting themselves might require sacrificing their co-conspirators. Sarah left town hall with a new understanding of her own capabilities and the power that came from thorough preparation combined with moral authority. The brass badge in her pocket felt different now, not just a memento of Walter's faith in her abilities, but a symbol of the responsibility that came with exposing corruption and demanding accountability. She'd proven to herself that ordinary citizens could confront powerful officials effectively when they possessed superior information and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. Walter's final case had become her education in how democracy was supposed to function when people refused to accept easy lies about complex problems. The 30-day countdown had begun, and Sarah knew that Bradley's initial response was probably just the opening move in a more serious confrontation. But she also understood that her investigation had already progressed beyond the point where intimidation or bureaucratic delay tactics could prevent the truth from emerging. Sometimes the most effective power was wielded by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from forcing accountability on those who'd forgotten that their authority came from the citizens they were supposed to serve. The emergency town council meeting was called for 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, ostensibly to address concerns about citizen harassment of municipal officials and the need for proper procedures regarding public information requests. Mayor Bradley's agenda was carefully worded to frame Sarah's investigation as inappropriate interference rather than legitimate oversight. But his strategy backfired when nearly 60 residents attended the meeting, triple the usual attendance for regular council sessions. Word had spread through Millbrook's informal communication network about Sarah's confrontation with Bradley, And people who normally ignored local politics suddenly found themselves curious about why their waitress was asking uncomfortable questions about town finances. Sarah arrived early and claimed a seat in the front row, her laptop bag containing copies of every document she'd gathered during her investigation. The atmosphere in the council chamber felt charged with anticipation, as neighbors who'd known each other for decades tried to understand what was happening to their quiet town. Bradley opened the meeting with remarks about the importance of respectful discourse and proper channels for citizen concerns. But his attempt to control the narrative was undermined by the obvious tension radiating from Morrison and Walsh. Both council members appeared nervous and defensive, occasionally whispering to each other in ways that made their discomfort visible to everyone present. When Bradley invited Sarah to address the council about her concerns, she stood and opened her laptop with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Her presentation began with a simple question. Why had Morrison Construction been paid over $8 million for sewer improvements that weren't visible to anyone driving through Millbrook? Sarah displayed before and after photographs of streets that showed no evidence of recent work, alongside invoices claiming that extensive excavation and pipe replacement had occurred. She explained the bidding process that consistently favored Morrison despite higher prices, and the change orders that doubled project costs without corresponding improvements in scope or quality. The audience's reaction shifted from polite attention to engaged concern, as Sarah presented her evidence methodically and clearly. She avoided technical jargon and focused on practical questions that any taxpayer could understand. Where had the money gone? What had citizens received for their investment? And why weren't elected officials asking the same questions? When Sarah displayed the conflict of interest documentation showing Morrison voting on his own company's contracts, several audience members audibly gasped. The revelation that their council member had been directly profiting from decisions he'd helped make struck many residents as a fundamental betrayal of public trust. Morrison's attempt to defend himself only deepened his credibility problem. He argued that his construction company provided superior service that justified premium pricing, and that his years of local experience made him uniquely qualified to evaluate infrastructure projects. But when Sarah asked him to identify specific streets where Morrison Construction had actually performed the work they'd been paid for, his responses became increasingly vague and defensive. The disconnect between Morrison's claims and the physical evidence that residents could verify by driving through their own neighborhoods made his explanations seem increasingly implausible. The meeting's turning point came when Janet Walsh, apparently realizing that her association with Bradley and Morrison was becoming politically toxic, acknowledged that the town's financial oversight procedures had been inadequate and might have allowed irregularities to occur. Her admission that controls meant to prevent corruption had been ignored or circumvented gave official credibility to Sarah's allegations. Walsh's attempt to distance herself from Bradley and Morrison's decisions created exactly the kind of internal division that Walter's notebooks had predicted would eventually destroy corruption conspiracies. Sarah concluded her presentation with a detailed proposal for immediate reforms. Establishment of an independent citizens oversight committee, mandatory competitive bidding for all contracts exceeding $25,000, and full disclosure of any potential conflicts of interest before council votes. She also announced her intention to forward her complete investigation to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, regardless of whether the town council chose to implement reforms. The announcement that federal law enforcement would be reviewing Millbrook's finances transformed the meeting from a local political dispute into a preview of serious legal consequences. The public comment period that followed Sarah's presentation revealed the depth of community frustration that had been building for years. Business owners described how they'd been excluded from bidding on municipal contracts despite offering lower prices than preferred vendors. Residents complained about deteriorating infrastructure despite repeated promises that major improvements were underway. Several people questioned why their property taxes had increased significantly, while the town's debt continued growing despite supposedly successful economic development initiatives. The pattern of complaints suggested that Sarah's investigation had given voice to concerns that many residents had harbored privately but never felt empowered to express publicly. Bradley's attempt to regain control of the narrative fell flat when he suggested that Sarah's allegations were based on misunderstandings that could be resolved through proper education about municipal finance. The audience's response was skeptical and occasionally hostile, particularly when Bradley implied that ordinary citizens lacked the expertise necessary to evaluate their government's performance. His condescending tone backfired badly in a room full of people who just witnessed a waitress present evidence that their elected officials had either ignored or covered up for years. The meeting concluded with Bradley's announcement that the town council would consider Sarah's recommendations and respond within 30 days. But the damage to his administration's credibility was already irreversible. As residents filed out of the chamber, Sarah overheard conversations about recalling elected officials, organizing citizen watchdog groups, and demanding transparency from future council meetings. Walter's faith in democracy's self-correcting mechanisms was being validated by neighbors who discovered that citizen oversight was both necessary and possible when someone had the courage to ask hard questions and demand honest answers. The brass badge in Sarah's pocket felt lighter as she walked home through streets she'd known her entire life. She'd proven that ordinary people could hold powerful officials accountable when they combined preparation with persistence, and that democracy worked best when citizens refused to accept corruption as inevitable. Walter's final case had become Millbrook's first step toward the kind of government that actually served its residents rather than exploiting them. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's investigation moved with the efficiency of an organization that had prosecuted dozens of similar municipal corruption cases over the past decade. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez arrived in Millbrook 6 weeks after receiving Sarah's comprehensive report, accompanied by forensic accountants and federal prosecutors who treated small-town graft with the same seriousness they'd apply to major corporate fraud. The investigation team set up operations in the conference room at Millbrook's public library, creating an atmosphere of official scrutiny that made corrupt officials' continuing denials seem increasingly desperate and futile. Rick Morrison was arrested on a Tuesday morning as he arrived at his construction company's offices, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of public trust in connection with the inflated municipal contracts that Sarah's investigation had exposed. The charges carried potential sentences totaling 15 years in prison and restitution requirements that would likely bankrupt his business and force liquidation of his family's assets. Morrison's attempts to blame other officials for decisions he'd participated in were undermined by the detailed evidence Sarah had compiled, including recorded council meetings where he'd voted on contracts that directly benefited his company. Janet Walsh's cooperation with prosecutors earned her a plea agreement that reduced her potential sentence to 2 years probation in exchange for testimony about the financial irregularities she'd facilitated as town treasurer. Her detailed admissions confirmed Sarah's analysis of the systematic overbilling and phantom projects that had diverted millions of dollars from legitimate infrastructure improvements to Morrison Construction's accounts. Walsh's testimony also revealed that Mayor Bradley had pressured her to minimize financial disclosures and delay responses to citizen information requests, establishing a pattern of conspiracy that strengthened the case against Morrison and Bradley. Mayor Bradley's resignation came 3 days before prosecutors were scheduled to file formal charges against him for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. His decision to step down was accompanied by a statement accepting responsibility for management failures that had allowed inappropriate practices to occur under his administration. The carefully worded resignation avoided admitting criminal liability but acknowledged that his leadership had been inadequate to prevent the corruption that Sarah's investigation had exposed. Bradley's political career was effectively over, and his real estate development business faced civil litigation from investors who'd relied on insider information about infrastructure projects that were never completed. The financial recovery process required 6 months of forensic accounting to determine exactly how much money Morrison Construction owed Millbrook's taxpayers. The final restitution order totaled $12.4 million, representing the difference between what the company had been paid and the value of work actually performed. Morrison Construction's assets, including equipment, property, and cash accounts, were liquidated to satisfy the judgment, though the recovery process only yielded approximately half of what had been stolen. The remaining debt was structured as a payment plan that would garnish Morrison's future earnings for the rest of his working life. Sarah found herself appointed to chair the Citizens Oversight Committee that was established as part of Millbrook's recovery plan. The committee was granted authority to review all municipal contracts, attend closed-session council meetings, and publish quarterly reports about government spending and performance. Sarah's role required her to reduce her hours at the diner, but Walter's inheritance had provided financial security that allowed her to dedicate significant time to ensuring that corruption wouldn't return to Millbrook's government. The committee's oversight prevented several questionable contracts from being approved and forced implementation of competitive bidding procedures that saved taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. The infrastructure improvements that Morrison Construction had been paid to complete were finally implemented by legitimate contractors who bid competitively and performed work that met professional standards. The sewer system rehabilitation was completed for 60% of what Morrison had been paid, while actually delivering the flood prevention and drainage improvements that residents had been promised for years. New sidewalks, street repairs, and playground equipment appeared throughout Millbrook as recovered funds were redirected toward projects that provided tangible benefits to the community. Sarah's investigation had unexpected consequences beyond Millbrook's borders when prosecutors discovered that Morrison Construction had similar contracts with 3 neighboring townships that showed identical patterns of overbilling and phantom work. The regional investigation ultimately resulted in 8 additional corruption prosecutions and recovery of over $30 million in fraudulent payments. Sarah testified before a state legislative committee about the importance of citizen oversight in preventing municipal corruption, and her case became a model for other communities dealing with similar problems. The most satisfying moment of the recovery process came when Sarah attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Millbrook's renovated public library, funded partly by recovered corruption money and partly by federal grants that the town qualified for after implementing transparency reforms. The ceremony was held in the same room where prosecutors had set up their investigation 6 months earlier, and Sarah reflected on how spaces could be transformed when honest people replaced corrupt officials. The library's expanded hours and updated computer facilities provided educational opportunities that would benefit Millbrook's residents for generations. Walter's influence on Millbrook's transformation extended beyond the specific corruption he'd identified. The oversight procedures that Sarah helped establish created a culture of transparency that made future corruption much more difficult to conceal. Council meetings were now attended by engaged citizens who asked informed questions and demanded detailed explanations for municipal decisions. The local newspaper expanded its government coverage, and citizen watchdog groups monitored spending patterns that might indicate recurring problems. Democracy was functioning the way Walter had believed it should when ordinary people took responsibility for holding their representatives accountable. 2 years after the helicopter landed behind Lou's diner, Sarah Martinez stood in the same spot where Walter Hennings had scattered wild daisy seeds during one of their early morning conversations. The vacant lot had been transformed into Millbrook Community Park, featuring playground equipment purchased with recovered corruption funds and maintained by volunteers who understood that civic engagement extended beyond voting every few years. Children played on swings and slides while their parents organized weekend cleanup efforts and planning meetings for additional park improvements. The space that had once symbolized neglect and missed opportunities now represented community renewal and shared responsibility. Sarah's role had evolved from waitress to civic leader, though she maintained her morning shifts at the diner partly out of loyalty to Lou and partly because she enjoyed the daily interactions with neighbors who'd supported her investigation when doing so required considerable courage. The brass police badge that had started her journey now held a place of honor in a display case at the renovated library, accompanied by a plaque dedicating the Walter Hennings Civic Engagement Collection to residents who believed that democracy required active participation rather than passive compliance. The collection included Walter's investigation notebooks, documentation from the corruption prosecution, and resources for citizens who wanted to monitor their local government's performance. The financial impact of Sarah's investigation continued to benefit Millbrook through infrastructure improvements that addressed decades of deferred maintenance and systematic underinvestment. Streets that had been rutted with potholes were professionally repaved, and storm drains that had backed up during every heavy rain now functioned as designed. The town's bond rating improved significantly after implementing transparency reforms and establishing reserve funds that protected against future fiscal emergencies. Municipal finances were now managed according to professional standards rather than political convenience, and citizens received quarterly reports that explained spending patterns in language that didn't require specialized accounting knowledge to understand. Sarah's mother, Maria, had lived to see her daughter recognized as Millbrook's Citizen of the Year, an honor that acknowledged not just the corruption investigation, but Sarah's ongoing work to strengthen democratic institutions and civic engagement. Maria Martinez died peacefully in the comfortable bedroom of the house that Sarah had purchased with Walter's inheritance, surrounded by family and neighbors who'd benefited from the changes her daughter had initiated. Her final words to Sarah emphasized that immigrants understood better than most people that democracy was fragile and required constant vigilance to prevent powerful interests from exploiting ordinary citizens. The broader implications of Sarah's investigation extended far beyond Millbrook when her case became a subject of study in public administration programs and government ethics courses. University researchers interviewed Sarah about the techniques she'd developed for analyzing municipal finances without formal training, and her methods were incorporated into citizen oversight guides distributed by good government organizations. Sarah occasionally spoke at conferences about the importance of transparency and accountability in local government, though she always emphasized that her success had depended on Walter's groundwork and community support, rather than any special qualifications she possessed. The most meaningful validation of Sarah's work came when she received a letter from the Pennsylvania Attorney General thanking her for preventing what prosecutors estimated would have been $40 million in additional theft if Morrison's corruption had continued unchecked. The investigation had deterred similar schemes in other municipalities where officials realized that citizen oversight was becoming more sophisticated and effective. Sarah's case demonstrated that corruption could be defeated by ordinary people who combined moral courage with methodical investigation, and that democracy worked best when citizens refused to accept official explanations that didn't match observable facts. On quiet mornings at the diner, Sarah sometimes sat at table 7 where Walter had spent his final years observing and documenting the corruption that she'd eventually exposed. The booth had become an informal memorial where longtime customers shared stories about Walter's quiet generosity and his faith in democracy's capacity for self-correction. Sarah often reflected on how Walter had chosen her not because she possessed special expertise, but because she demonstrated the kind of everyday integrity that made institutional corruption impossible to sustain when enough people demanded accountability. The brass badge that had begun Sarah's journey now resided permanently in Millbrook's library, but its symbolic power remained embedded in the town's renewed commitment to transparency and citizen engagement. Children who played in the community park would grow up in a municipality where government meetings were well attended, financial records were regularly reviewed, and elected officials understood that their authority came with obligations to the people they served. Walter's final gift to Millbrook had been the demonstration that corruption could be defeated by citizens who refused to accept it as inevitable. As Sarah poured coffee for the morning regulars and listened to their discussions about upcoming municipal elections and budget proposals, she understood that Walter's most important lesson had been about the relationship between individual responsibility and collective well-being. Democracy required active participation rather than passive trust, and the price of freedom was eternal vigilance exercised by ordinary people who believed that their community deserved honest leadership. Sometimes the most profound changes began with someone simply refusing to accept that things had to remain the way they'd always been. The wild daisies that bloomed each spring in Millbrook Community Park served as a reminder that beauty could grow from the ruins of corruption, and that communities could heal when people chose to work together rather than accept division and exploitation. Walter Hennings had believed that one person could make a difference when they combined moral courage with methodical preparation, and Sarah Martinez had proven that faith was justified. Sometimes, the most effective revolutions began in small towns where ordinary people decided that their neighbors deserved better than they'd been receiving from the people they'd elected to serve them. Sometimes, kindness opens doors power never could, And the most important investigations begin with someone who simply refuses to accept that corruption is the price of doing business.